Hello everyone, welcome to the Flux Dev Meeting. This is October 19th. Okay. Hey Travis, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi. Yes. Good morning from Seattle. I am a longtime Flux user and just recently been looking at contributing back to the tool. So I've been getting some really nice engagement with a lot of the maintainers through some RFCs or an RFC and pull requests. So yeah, I just wanted to get to know the team better, see what's going on, and maybe have a little elevator pitch for that RFC I've got out there.
Okay, which RFC is it?
It is RFC 6. It's the alternative suspend control.
Okay.
It's kind of come out of another thing I was looking at, which is like getting some sort of way to get a reason or a message attached to the object that you're suspending.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I know you chimed in there on the Slack channel. And it's kind of grown from that first thing into like, hey, what if we started using, the metadata annotations to suspend things instead of the spec? So I'm trying to just get my hands around that and absorb a lot of the feedback from the community and come up with a good plan.
Cool. So how is this solving the message part? Is it to be in the annotation or?
Okay, so I see two options here where if we use a metadata key to say, there's an alternative way to say that something is suspended, we can use that key to be truthy or falsy. And maybe truthy is anything that's not falsy. And that would mean you could put a message in there too, right? It could be true, 1, yes, some message, that's all truthy. It could be false, missing, 0, and that would be falsy. And so that would be your control. Alternatively, we could have, a really well recognized metadata key that's truthy or falsy with normal truthy falsy values. And then we could have a separate annotation for that's only known by the Flux CLI that has the message, so that you would kind of keep those two separate. So you would see, metadata suspended, yes or no, and then optionally, if you use the CLI and added the flag like message dash dash message or dash dash reason, you would maybe get an additional metadata that's right underneath that says, here's some extra information about it,
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, I kind of like the idea that the value of the key can be the message and just presence of the key means it's suspended unless it's set to false. Um, one one issue that I see with having this alternative suspension way is around metrics. Sunny, do you have any ideas around it? How can we deal with
We
metrics for?
discussed about we discussed about it already in the pull request that metrics can be extracted using CubeSat metrics.
Can CubeSat metrics do an OR?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I heard that the metrics got deprecated in favor of using the CubeSat metrics info.
Right, we deprecated suspend metrics as well. We just report duration, reconciliation duration.
So wait, in CubeStat metrics, can you say, look at this key in the annotation, and if it's not there, then fall back to the back?
I did some testing before commenting and showing the example. It works. You can
Nice.
say this annotation with this key. If it's present, enter a yes or no.
And we could also do the message inside the key.
Have to try that, I'm not sure. Maybe.
You know, we were
I
looking.
just tried with if it's present or not, it works. Maybe there is a way to check with the value as well. I think it will work because we have some configurations where we check for ready equal true. In this case, you'll say suspended equals some other value. I think it will work.
Equals false or, yeah. And if we can chain or conditions, then it's, yeah, if it's false, go to spec, see what's in there. If it's there, false, it's okay. If it's not false, it has some random text, make it as true. And don't look at spec anymore.
Can be done.
Yeah.
Some
Writing
complex
logic
conditions.
with YAML in cube state metrics is like, yeah, it is what it is. Yeah. YAML programmers, we all are. Okay, good. Yeah, people wanted to, and I kind of resisted that. At some point, they wanted to add the spec suspended to the kubectl output. When you do kubectl get, I don't know, hand releases, they wanted to have a column for suspended, and of course, columns in the way you specify columns in the CRD YAML. There is no way of having logic there and having all the things like or else whatever we are doing in kubestate metrics. So we'll implement that logic in the CLI, but will not add suspend ever to the kubectl output. And because it's not there, it's not any breaking change. So we can, yeah, go with this in the next minor or next minor. Do you have anything to comment on this RFC? Who is the sponsor of this RFC?
I can sponsor it. I'm happy to see it trip down again to the scope of the thing so that we can look at the other details later.
Thank you, Hidde.
I think it also goes well with the changes I will be making to the Helm controller in the next release. Because of course, people have been abusing this suspend thing to bump the generation. And if we would move to this without having alternative means available, then people would be stuck. But I think combined with the upcoming changes, everything slowly starts to move to annotations in terms of controlling the flow or life cycle of the object. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah, we avoid generation bump, which by default means we need to reconcile. Yeah, that's great. Anyway, suspend will never go away from the GA objects like customization and Git repository. So we need to make sure these two work together nicely.
Yeah, that's maybe one interesting thing to discuss, because if you would, I assume that eventually, because we see this as the better way to do things at the moment with our current knowledge, is that you would slowly want to move to make the CLI also control the annotation instead of the field in the object.
No,
But
what I
then,
wait.
yeah,
Yes, if we let's say Flux 2.3 or whatever, when this thing is implemented,
slowly.
we'll completely switch the CLI, right? And the CLI will no longer mutate the spec. Will
Yeah,
also
but except for backwards compatibility, because if you say someone uses the old CLI, but you then start to use the new CLI, you need to take both fields into account, because if you're unsuspending the object and you do not look at the Boolean value of the spec, then your research will continue to be stuck. So that's one thing to keep in mind in terms of backwards compatibility and making changes to the CLI, is that we need to continuously keep track of the values of both fields when we do mutations to either suspend or unsuspend the resource.
why? Wait a second. So let's say in Flux 2.3, we switch the CLI from patching spec to adding or removing an annotation, right? Why should Flux 2.3 look at the spec anymore?
Because if you have a colleague who hasn't updated their Flux CLI version yet, and they do a suspend, and you with your new CLI do an unsuspend, but the spec suspend is no longer taken into account, then you're not unsuspending the resource. Because in one case, the Boolean value has been set on the spec, and in the other case, it's trying to remove the annotation, which isn't there. So
Oh yeah. We'll not remove the annotation. We have to set it to false to
no,
all
I
the way
think I
over,
think
right?
I think the best option is to look at both values, and then for suspend you would only continue to set the annotation, except if suspend's already true or if you're being provided a reason or whatnot. And then for unsuspend, you always need to look at both values and then arrange it in such a way that the Boolean, I think, will be set to false and the annotation would be removed or something.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
then
yeah. But you'll
if
only
you,
read from the spec. You'll never write to the spec in the next version, which is fine.
yeah, one of the things to take into account then is that the other way around can also happen. Say that you, with your new CLI version, set this suspend annotation, and your colleague has an older CLI version that tries to unsuspend the resource, then it will be stuck.
Yeah, of
But
course.
that's probably kind of expected. We can't make it really. Yeah, what you could do is detect the Flux version on the cluster, and then as long as the Flux version is below the version that introduced the annotations switch in the CLI, you would modify the field or the spec
Yeah,
field.
but if, let's say if the, of course, but if the cluster admin upgrades Flux, all the devs are not upgrading their CLIs. They are very old. The version in the cluster is 2.3, and they'll not be able to unsuspend. All right, because there is nothing, we can't just roll back in time and put some code in.
No. That's my, but you can try to make it as pleasant as possible.
Yeah, anyway, this RFC should definitely have a section here that deals with breaking changes and how this will affect users which don't.
And I think taking the cluster version into account is good anyway, because imagine you are in the process of updating your very old cluster to a much newer version of Flux, and you want to suspend a resource before you do an upgrade for some reason. If the CLI wouldn't look at the Flux version that's deployed on the cluster, it may try to suspend something through annotations because that's the new thing it knows, while the active version of the cluster doesn't have the logic within the controllers yet to look at those annotations. So that would mean that you give a false sense of the thing being suspended. So you need to take the version into account in any case.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, it gets really, really messy and complicated.
If we always consider that we are going to maintain the same behavior and recognition of the spec field, but we're just adding in manipulation of this other and recognition of this other annotation key, I think that should be proof against, version skews. Because no matter what version controllers or CLI you have, old ones will always mutate that spec value, but new ones will recognize it. New ones will add the annotation. And I guess the only problem I can see is that the new CLI would only add the annotation. The old CLI wouldn't even look for it, so it would give you a different response.
No, the issue is you have Flux 2.1 on the cluster, you upgrade your CLI to 2.3, you do Flux suspend, great, the new CLI add the annotations, but the controllers don't look at it. So you have the feeling that, okay, now I can move things from Git, from one customization to another, and while you'll do that, those things are not suspended, garbage collection kicks in, and you can wipe your whole cluster, your whole production cluster, clean up everything that you have there, which is a major incident that we really don't want to happen. So we really need to look at the version of the things in the cluster and have the new CLI mutate the spec instead of adding annotations if the cluster is older. Because we risk wiping everything out, because people look at the docs and our doc says, hey, if you want to move, let's say, your Kafka cluster from your Kafka cluster definition from one directory to another, you should suspend the customization, move it, and once you move it, nothing will happen. Flux will not delete your cluster inside Kubernetes, right? And then you resume it. But if typing Flux suspend does nothing because you're running on an older version, the moment you move it and you commit it, very bad things will happen. And people have no idea that that's the case, right?
Yeah, your Flux CLI would say that it is suspended.
Yeah. Well, in fact, it's not, because the controllers have no idea about it. So,
in this case, wouldn't it be better to provide a feedback to tell the user that this object is actually suspended?
how?
I don't know how, maybe status. Like, how will the user
It also
know?
still doesn't work. It still doesn't work because if you have to introduce a new field in the status, then older versions of the CLI will not know about that version in the status. So you end up in the same position you're in now. Basically, an older version of the CLI not knowing about what's in the resource.
Also, suspend means you don't do any kind of reconciliation, right? So how would the controller set something in status if suspend means you don't reconcile?
You can program it such that the first time it happened, you do partial reconciliation and patch the status.
Yeah, but the idea is that it blocks all mutations to the object as a whole, or at least that's how we intended it to be. I had a separate question. Oh, yeah. So, Stefan, if I remember correctly from the issue you showed to me earlier today, the version detection is done best by looking at the labels on the custom resource definition. Am I right?
Yes.
Next question then. If you would need to query the custom resource definitions every time you do a suspend, because you need to check on the version, how expensive would that be?
We can use the metadata client and only fetch the metadata instead of fetching the whole CRD. And that will be very light on etcd because metadata is, so it doesn't have to pull the whole CRD, which can be quite big.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I chose Git repository because Git repository goes to GA. It went to GA and we are going to delete the old versions early next year. It will pass 6 months since we did GA and we told people that we will be removing the beta versions. So it will be very, very light, but we can definitely use the metadata client and not get the whole spec of the CRD, only the metadata header. But now that I'm thinking about it, for suspend and resume breaks multi-tenancy because no tenant has access to CRDs. So we can't use CRDs for suspend and resume because tenants should be able to suspend and resume things in their own namespaces. And they only have access to that namespace. CRD is a global object. And there is no label, no nothing in a tenant namespace that gives away the Flux version. The Flux version is only on CRDs and the Flux namespace, which a tenant by default has no access to. So we can't query the server and find out the version for the suspend and resume.
They don't have get access to the custom resource definitions.
What?
They don't have listing access to custom resource definitions.
No. Of course
This metadata client, is this the same as the discovery client?
not. No.
Something else?
No, it's in controller runtime. It's like a very lightweight thing that only keeps track of basically the object metadata. So names, labels, annotations, those kind of things. And the idea is, or originally, I think, say that you want to watch a lot of secrets, or you want to watch a lot of config maps or whatever, and you want to get a stream of events, then if you would use a normal client, then you get to all of the objects in your cache. And with a metadata only client, you only get things like, hey, did the generation of this object change? Or hey, did it get this label? Or did it get this annotation? But you don't get the further data about the resource. It's very lightweight and you can easily watch thousands or many more.
Sounds like this was made for many things, but I don't remember exactly what Discovery Client does. But when I used it long time ago, it was made for this specific purpose, knowing the versions of different APIs you have. So maybe Discovery Client is the right tool. I don't know, I need to look into it.
I don't think so, because the discovery client does a refresh of CRDs every time you initialize it, which we definitely don't want. We've used the discovery client in Flux One, it was a disaster.
Things may have changed. Need to check
No, because I know Helm still uses it, and the reason I introduced a persistent client flag there was so that Helm wouldn't continuously reinitialize the discovery client and then download all the custom resource definitions to be able to,
There is no reason why we should use the discovery client where controller runtime, that's the client that we use everywhere, also has this lightweight version for metadata, and this is exactly what we want. We don't want to go to client go and discovery client, which are really, really massive in terms of how many API calls they do, how often they refresh the cache. They rely on a local disk cache and so on. We really don't want any of those into Flux.
But back to the multi-tenancy problem. So for multi-tenancy, Flux check also doesn't work, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Flux check is
So
admin thing.
yeah, as a safety precaution, you could say, well, if you're unable to determine the version, we fall back to modifying the spec. Would kind of make it a non-tenant exclusive feature to be able to. Yeah, and then you could also say, like, if you provide a reason, like if you do flux suspend dash reason, then it always uses the annotation because it has no other means. So a tenant which knows that he is on a certain version can still use it.
I don't see how we are avoiding any of the things we talked about. So let's say a tenant updates the CLI. The admin does not update the cluster. The tenant has the latest CLI, which does suspending through annotations. He says, Flux suspend dash message. I'm moving my things from this directory to this directory. And that's why I'm suspending. He runs this command. Flux, the CLI has no access to CRDs, to Flux system namespace, to anything. It can't detect the version. It will add the annotation there. The tenant will think, great, now I've suspended the stuff. I can now go and move my things in my repo. And while he or she will move it, Flux will delete everything.
So if it can determine the version, it can print a warning. And
the CLI has no means, the CLI that a tenant uses has no means, has no way of finding out which server, which version of Flux is running on a particular cluster.
I understand that, but you can detect the fact that you can't detect that. And then you can display a warning like, hey, you just used this feature and we can't determine if your version is actually supporting it because we can't determine your version. And please double check if you're actually if it's actually capable of taking it into account. I mean, it's not very different from the CLI introducing support for some new field in a custom resource definition, which is already in GA, right? Because you can still introduce fields, but if your administrator hasn't updated the CRDs to include that field, the CLI will still fail because you will try to insert something. Now, in this case, of course, it's maybe more of a problem because it's trying to do pretty destructive things. But if you can't detect the version, then you can still display a warning, and then it's up to the user to kind of confirm that they are actually on that version. And then you at least have yourself covered in terms of, hey, I just tried this and it's.
The problem with using labels and annotations means that you lose all the type safety of everything. You're no longer type safe, right? If you upgrade the CRD to a new version, right, or you don't upgrade the CRD and you use a newer CLI and you try to set a field which is not there registered on the cluster, even if you are a tenant, you'll get a reject from the API and say, I don't know this field. You can't set it. But if you move things from the spec to annotations and labels, then there is no way of validating anything, right? It's YOLO apply because nothing is type safe anymore. It's string. So it's very different from adding or removing fields in the spec, dealing with adding behavioral changes through annotations or labels, right? I mean, Kubernetes moved from putting random things in a config map to CRDs to get, validation, type safety, and so on. Now we are moving things from the spec into this string thing, and we lose all the validation and everything the CRD offers.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to do these kinds of things through type declarations, because it's not really part of your spec. It's not a really like if you say that you have a reason to suspend something and you would want to include this in the spec, then you would have a suspend field with a nested, I don't know, enable, suspend, enable, and a suspend reason. And then anytime you change the reason or something, then you update your spec, which increases the generation. Like, it has nothing to do with the desired state. You really want to just pause it. It's like, oh no, I put a lock on this, so please don't do it, which is kind of different. And then we, of course, also, because we had like this scaling proposal with a desire from people, which kind of made me think a lot about, okay, what if you introduce a custom resource which kind of does suspension, but through a separate kind of object type, and that has kind of other problems, because then you're working with references and you have to find the right thing, which is also very imperfect in that way, because it creates a lot of things people have to think about. Plus, it creates the problem of having like these two separations of truth. Like, hey, what if you update your reference later than the object you create, or you switch the like it, because they're separate objects. There's a lot more room for inconsistency between them. Well, if you would suspend something, you really want it to be consistent. So altogether, I think that makes this the best way from a certain perspective, that it doesn't mutate the spec, it doesn't create this extra resource kind at the cost of indeed not being type safe. But then I think the core of the problem is that we introduced it once, and now we have to deal with the fact that we once introduced a type safe thing. Whereas if we just went with the annotation from the very beginning, there was much less to worry about in a way.
Yeah, if we could have removed suspend from all our APIs, then it wouldn't be an issue, because if you'd run Flux suspend with an older CLI and the cluster has upgrade, you'll get an error. That field is not there, you cancel it. And on the other way around, write it to the new. Oh no, it wouldn't work in a backwards way if we remove the field. Let me think about it. Ah, yeah, you could try in the new CRD to set suspend in the spec with a dry run without mutating anything. If you get an error back that, okay, you are on the latest version, let's say you are a tenant and you can't look at CRD versions. And if you don't get an error from the dry run, then you would set it in spec, because it means the cluster is old. So removing spec would actually solve the issue that we are discussing. Removing suspend from the spec, because you don't need to query the CRDs anymore, or the versions.
At the cost of breaking somewhere.
Yeah. And breaking our promise to all Flux users that, hey, we did a GA release and we are not going to remove fields that will break everybody's clusters. Right? I know a bunch of people which have suspend. They don't do suspend through the CLI because they don't have access to the cluster, and all their tenants are suspending and resuming things from the Git repo through pull requests. So for those people, they will find it unacceptable to do a Flux upgrade, and all of a sudden everything will fail.
How about having different behaviors for the 3 GA APIs and different for the others. Like for the ones that are not GA yet, we remove it. But
I
the
think
ones that have,
that would make things more confusing.
And the major problem with suspend, where it's really, really impactful and you wipe your whole cluster and you get into a really bad situation, is with Flux customization, which is UI. If the CLI tells you, yes, I have suspended the customization, but in fact you didn't, and you usually suspend these things when you do a refactoring of your repo or you want to move things from one side to another, then you are like in a really
maybe
bad
we
situation.
can,
You can't do that to users.
just an idea, this can be just invalid. You can use time. You say we are supporting it after enough time has passed, that the last supported version of Flux does understand this new thing.
You need V2. Semver does not allow you to do that.
No, you don't have to drop it. Uh, think, thinking.
Okay, I think we discussed enough about this. I think the RHP should definitely have a section with use cases. What happens if you run suspend with an older CLI, newer Flux on the cluster, older Flux on the cluster, newer CLI? What are the implications and how we solve them, if we can solve them, and then decide to go ahead with the RFC or not. If we put people at risk because of this, I'm not for having this RFC merged. I'm very frank with you now. If we don't find a way to protect people from shooting themselves in the foot because of us,
Yeah.
this will not go forward for me.
Yeah, I've taken notes. I'm going to add these cases in, and yeah, it really does seem like with all of the different use cases, right? Like access to the cluster or not. If you get rid of our ability to touch that spec field, then that is going to make it possible for some people to work with it. So
Yeah,
I'm
also tenancy
well,
and multi-tenancy, right? Which a lot of people are doing with Flux, where a tenant has no way of discovering the Flux version. We need to really address that use case.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for the feedback. It's really interesting to hear about and learn about how all this works. It's been very educational. I'm going to kind of fall back on, I'm going to document this stuff, but I want to fall back on that, just the reason field with the CLI RFC or pull request, the one that doesn't do anything. It just gives a person a way to add message in there and get and sort of step away from this control thing.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about next Flux minor release and what we want to get in there. Hide, can you say something about the current state with Helm controller and how you see things going out at the end of this year? I guess we can, the next minor release will come in the second week of December. Or we can do it earlier, but I don't think we have enough time. Any ideas?
I haven't really thought about a specific date, but I think beginning of December is probably the best, or at least the before the last 2 weeks.
Wait
In
a second.
terms of
I said the second week of December because Kubernetes 129 goes out on 5th of December. And we told people we are going to do.
yeah, then it makes sense. My point is just that we shouldn't be like, hey, we are updating all these things around December the 20th, and good luck right before Christmas if you want to update to the latest version.
No, I don't mean we have to bump the Kubernetes version, right? We by then we should really try to get to 128 and latest Helm and Customize, which are all blocked right now by the Gnostic package change.
Yeah, and Helm is also blocked by some other things because they did a refactor of the values, and I continue to see tiny issues about people reporting issues around backwards compatibility. So I'm kind of hesitant around introducing that, as it would, if it goes wrong, goes wrong, fully driven by automation, we have a lot of unhappy people, I assume. In terms of what will be included in the release. V2 Beta 2 of the Helm release will be included. It will contain a lot of changes around not the declaration of the spec, but the observability and the status and the way the controller itself determines what state a release is in and how it should proceed. It will also contain a fix to be able to unlock a release which got stuck into a stalled state. So besides the umkiller that got introduced a couple months back, it now also has a way to automatically unlock a release if it can observe that it did the last write itself. So in some edge cases, this may still not be sufficient, but in any case, if the controller succeeds in writing the last state and it observes that it did that after a reboot, it will unlock the release and will continue where it left off. Then it will introduce some annotations. So we talked about introducing a suspend annotation. And we already have a reconcile annotation. The idea is that there will be 2 new annotations which allow you to either force a retry through as a one-off kind of thing. So say it failed after 5 attempts and you just want to try it one more time, then you can set that annotation in combination with the reconcile add annotation and we'll try it one more time. The second one is an annotation to be able to reset the failure count. So say you have 5 failed attempts and the limit is also set to 5 and you want to start it from 0 again, you can set that annotation and it will reset the counter and it will continue to try 5 more times, which kind of deals with the suspend unsuspend trick people have been using. Is there anything else that's worth mentioning?
How that how would that work? I mean, you annotate with the timestamp or what?
Yeah, it works the same as reconcile add, and it would have it would take note of this in the status, and it would have a safety check also, so that reconcile add and the reset timestamp equal the same value, so that you don't have one person confirming the reconciliation and another person kind of putting in the other thing, and then having the surprising effect of your reconciliation being handled together with like a reset of failure count. It's kind of closely tied together. Is there anything else I'm forgetting?
And we'll also have, like, we can't release V2 Beta 2 without also having the diff in there, right?
Yeah, so I did a JSON, I rewrote, like at present you have the diff capability in the drift detection ability in the Helm controller, which is globally set through an options flag. This will be moved to something in the spec, so it will be in addition to the spec, but not really a breaking change. And this will allow you to enable drift detection on a Helm per Helm release basis, and it will also allow you to include ignore selectors to ignore specific JSON paths in one or more resources which are the result of the Helm release. This is done through the same kind of API Customize has with target selectors. So you can select, I don't know, a kind or a name or a combination of a kind, name, version, whatever, label selectors, whatnot. And then do a JSON path ignore rule to ignore a specific part of a resource. Then for the diff, it should be possible to include it in the Flux CLI. I'm not sure if I would be able to get that in, but the code is practically there. So it may well be that for for a short period of time until we land the next minor, which we can focus on the CLI improvements, it will continue to log diffs. I have thought already about the future though, and I think the way forward, as soon as the CLI supports the diffing, is that the controller would still report changes, but it would say like, hey, I created this or I updated this resource, I saw that it removed X things, it added Y things, and it changed Z things, so that you still kind of in the logs have an overview, like without having the full diff, like, okay, this is it like you can see the difference then between, oh, I changed like 101 things, or there's one thing continuing to bug this thing, so that you can kind of observe if it's
So basically, the CLI will give you a full diff, like do now for Flux customizations, and the controller will just give you an overview of an overview of changes, not the actual changes.
Yeah, a brief summary, because of course with the, oh sorry, my daughter is starting to cry, but a brief summary of changes basically, so that you still have some kind of output.
Yeah, cool. Great. And what about Helm repository? Sunny, you'll want to get that static changing,
Right.
on the
There have
version.
been some. Oh, I was about to say there have been some changes since the last time we discussed about making interval optional for Helm repository. I tried it. It caused some tests to fail, but I fixed them. It was tests had something wrong because of which it was failing. It's working for now. I can do some more testing. The request has all the code. It is ready to review, but I would like to do some more testing.
Okay, and we will couple Helm repository v1 beta 2 with Helm release v2 beta 2, right? Or no, Helm repository
It's the same.
beta 3.
And
Yeah.
the release and repository remains the same.
What do you mean?
It's not an API change, it's a controller change, I think.
No, we are making a field optional.
It's not required, it's optional. It's not breaking it. If you go from optional to required, then you break things.
Okay. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, from required to optional omit empty.
Oh, and another thing I want to try to get in, by the way, Stefan, is your request around allowing a chart ref, because I think that's both beneficial to people dealing with multi-tenants and having a single chart for many Helm releases so that they can refer their Helm chart themselves, and for the OCI repository example you gave, in which you can directly copy the chart from the registry and then refer it.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Helm chart as an object. I don't know how much work is it, but I would definitely ship in beta to the chart ref to an OCI repo, which is a single object that can be shared between many Helm releases.
If I do it for the OCI repository, it's the same work, except that you get an enum. But from the perspective of downloading it from the source controller, or skipping the fact that you have to apply the template, it's all the same for the Helm chart and for the OCI repository, because they both end up with the same tarball if they use a copy directive, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I wanted to force people on OCI, but yeah, anyway, it's okay. Yeah, in the end, it's the same chart ref, and you would change the kind from, you can all set the kind to Helm chart, or you set the kind to OCI repository. And for
Yeah,
the
and
controller, it's the same stuff.
yeah, it just reaches out. And I already wrote the code in such a way that you can basically provide it any source controller URL. So we just have to add a tiny bit of kind handling, basically, and ignoring the template if the chart ref is set. Those two things, but it's not very trivial.
One annoying thing is the fact that we can no longer make anything required. So chart ref is optional, chart must be optional, because you can set either of these one. And controller runtime, cube builder annotations, and controller gen still do not support one of. So you basically lose the whole validation. People could create a Helm release with no chart at all, no chart ref either, and it will pass the API validation. And then so you have to take this into account in Helm controller, and Helm controller shouldn't panic or something. It should, I don't know, set the status to
Not ready.
not ready, because there is you haven't specified chart, and you didn't specify neither chart ref. But then, because we don't have open API for this, what happens if then, because both are optional and you cannot say one of, then people can have chart ref and chart in the same Helm release. Then we need to pick one.
I would say the chart ref then goes above
the
template, because it's much lighter to deal with in the end.
Yes. Yeah, I would still issue, I don't know, a warning in the logs and say that we picked chart ref over chart. But yeah, sounds great.
Sounds good to me as well. We are on time, or at least over time. I think the official time
Can you
for this
wait?
is 45 minutes.
I just thought about what I was trying to say initially about the suspending. But before that, notification control V1 beta 3 is also for the service. Alert and provider change.
For the
Notification controller V1 beta 3 for alert and provider will also be in the next release.
okay.
It's also ready. Pull request is ready. Just need to try and review things. Maybe 5 minutes. I just want to tell you what I was thinking initially about the timing-based approach. So we can create a new CLI which updates both spec and annotation for a certain period of time. So new CLI users, when they use against all clusters, it will still work. After maybe some months or maybe a year, whenever we reach a state where the last supported version of Flux also understands annotation, the next version can stop touching spec. Now all supported versions of Flux will understand annotation.
Theoretically, you can indeed use our support pledge to stop facilitating certain things at certain versions. That's true.
Yeah, but we'll keep updating spec. If we go with this way, we'll keep updating spec for, I don't know, next year.
That's okay,
That's
right?
fine.
Is there any downside? You do it today, continue doing it.
I see no downside and no improvement.
Improvement will come later.
Yeah, there is an improvement. There is an improvement because even if your old CLI version doesn't recognize the annotation as a mechanic kind of thing, or your controller doesn't, you can still use it as a way to provide a reason in controller versions that don't support the reason field. So there is kind of this the establishment of the standard in which you already provide a reason without it mechanically having any effect. So I think there's an upside to it.
Yeah, fair. Okay, put this in the RFC and let's discuss it next meeting.
One more thing regarding us talking about feedback. So when people use annotation, there's no feedback to tell people that it has been, this controller understands it. So I was saying maybe we can put something in the status. Or another idea would be we can emit an event. If it's in the status, CLI can read it and tell you it's actually suspended. If it's event, it's hard. Or another way could be if you don't want to introduce anything more in the status, you can add a new status condition saying suspended true.
Yeah, I'm not for patching the object if it's suspended, but a lot of people have asked for events when things get suspended because people suspend things, they forget about it. The cluster admin has no way of knowing it unless it looks over the whole cluster and so on. And people
The
have
problem is that if you then do a controller restart and you don't maintain state, so you're not keeping track of a timestamp like we do for reconcile at, then anytime a controller gets kicked off a node and gets booted up again, or you receive an event and in some way it still schedules reconciliation, you will be reminded about the fact that your resource is suspended. Which
status.
Yeah, but the status is like breaking the promise of not touching the object in a way.
Why? It's a mechanism for feedback, right? You're touching the object, it's okay, you're not implementing the generation.
Yeah, but if you start to reach into that area, then you could also say like for a Git repository, if you suspend the object, it stops fetching data from Git, but it continues to reconcile the storage because hey, that's not really, it's like, where's the gap then, or where does it stop?
For the implementation part, I thought about it. It's like the first time controller sees that it's suspended, it will do a half reconciliation and skip. Next time, the predicates will not allow it to be passed in. It will not reach the reconsider at all. Predicates will allow it only when it sees it's switching the old and new objects are switching the value of suspend. Maybe we can discuss again later, but this can come later.
I think it can be discussed as a hey, we want to provide a suspend event to users, which would automatically make you touch into the subject because you need to deal with spam. But I think for the introduction of the suspend annotation by itself, it's not really worth the discussion. All right, let's cut an end to this meeting. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
And see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Right?